Yes.
Isn't there a video game museum in Dallas?
It's
Frisco.
north of Dallas in Frisco.
Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, it's incredible.
It is really nice.
Yeah, it's currently 10,000 square feet, and they want to do 50,000 ultimately, and have like a library where you can check out games and everything. That's like long-term plans. I'm 45 minutes from there, where I live in Fort Worth, and I've probably been almost 20 times by now. Usually for an event like a press junket or VIP dinner or whatever. But anyway, it's just a great, fun place to go. And if you're ever in Dallas, Fort Worth for any reason, it is well worth checking out. It's run by some of the OG guys, Joe Santulli, John Hardy, and Sean Kelly. And they've been at it even a little longer than me, so it's I appreciate the, they got a lot of cool vintage stuff. All right, it is just about time to start. Does there happen to be anybody here that doesn't know what the video game crash of '83 is? I figure most of you do, or you might not. Like, what? I'm not going to that. Looks like everybody knows. That's good. And just briefly, the early '80s was an incredible boom for console video games. As a matter of fact, in 1983, there were $3.25 billion in sales. And by 1985, it had gone down to 100 million, which in the grand scheme of things is basically nothing. And while all of you have heard of the crash, I might be new to you. My name is Weiss, and I write books about video games, and I've been doing that for a long time. My first book came out in 2007, covering the pre-NES era of consoles. And at that time, the retro game book publishing industry was barely a thing. There were a few video game books at that time covering, like video game history, like by Leonard Herman and Ross and Stovall and some others, and Van Burnham, but there weren't many. And so anyway, I also do YouTube if you want to check out my channel, just under my name, Brett Weiss. But before we get to the crash, so you hear a lot about the crash and the reasons for the crash. And those are pretty well documented. But I've got some sort of secondary, lesser known reasons for the crash, some anecdotally and some just, very much fact-based and, just living through it. You really saw this thing from a first-person perspective. And I will get to the crash very briefly here in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about my pre-crash history, just sort of what led up to me being a gamer and collector in 1983, when you could buy games for as little as 99 cents a piece. And I've heard some people say they saw games at KB Toys and various outlets for as little as $0.25 a piece. I never saw any personally for $0.25. I'm curious if any of you guys ever saw any games during the crash for less than 99 cents. I've heard 3 for $5, 99 cents and everything, but yeah. Anyway, so in 1975, that's when I discovered video games. At least that's my first memory. My parents would occasionally take us to a bowling alley or a skating rink or something like that. And I distinctly remember playing Pong, 2 players obviously, and Midway's Gunfight, another incredible 2-player game where you're just sort of, you just stick figures, you're walking out and shooting each other. That was just incredible. And I played a lot of pinball before that, and huge pinball fan. So that was 75. Well, later that year in 75, for Christmas, we went to my cousin's house, and he tells me and my brother, hey, come back to my room. Let me show you what I got for Christmas. I'm like, sure. And he was the kind of guy who, do you know anybody that, like when you were growing up, their house wasn't great, and maybe it even smelled a little bit because they had too many pets, and they kind of had a jalopy of a car, but their parents bought them the kids anything they wanted anyway, and this was kind of like how my cousin was.
Looks neat.
And yeah, and so he comes back here and he goes, look, and so he's got this black and white TV in his bedroom and Atari Pong hooked up to it. And I was 8 years old, and this absolutely blew my mind. I had no idea that you could play video games in a house because I had never heard of the Magnavox Odyssey. 8 years old, I was watching cartoons and stuff, but I don't recall ever seeing a TV commercial for the 1972 Magnavox Odyssey. Didn't know about it, none of my friends had it, and so I literally didn't know you could be at home playing a video game. That just blew my mind. And then in 1976, the next year, just by some bizarre coincidence, considering the fact that this console was pretty obscure even when it was new, my two very best friends, my next door neighbor and a guy that lived a mile down the street from me, each had a Fairchild Channel F. And the fact that you could switch out cartridges and not just keep playing Pong variants was obviously another mind-blowing moment. And when I would go to their house, I was like, oh, and they were doing anything other than playing outside or playing Fairchild Channel F. I'm like, what are you doing? Why aren't you playing Fairchild? Because to me, that was just like the most incredible thing ever. And then in '77, my friends started getting Ataris. The VCS was out at that point, and you know, it was like $250, and cartridges were anywhere from $30 to about $45, $46. I distinctly remember seeing Missile Command and Asteroids for $45, $46, which, you know, translates to a lot right now, considering inflation and everything. But this was no way were my parents going to spend that exorbitant amount of money on Christmas. Our Christmas is cut off at $100. We knew that going in, and but I was content playing my friends, my cousins, Atari 2600s. You know, we'd go there, and I distinctly remember playing Combat and listening to the greatest hits of Air Supply over and over for some strange reason. It goes shockingly well with Combat. Anyway, so that was '77. I was in junior high. I was content. You know, I just knew that video games were too expensive, so I was just glad I could go to friends' houses. But then in '77 and '78, with auto race and baseball and football, basketball from Mattel, the handhelds, those were $30 each. Very doable for Christmas and even one for birthday. So my brother and I amassed a small collection of these and enjoyed those. And then in '81, I was 14. My 16-year-old girlfriend had an Intellivision, and she had a car, which was really cool. But I thought it was even cooler that she had an Intellivision than a car, because at that point I was just like insanely obsessed with video games. And then so when the Intellivision was out, it was, you know, the mature console, the sophisticated console, and a lot of adults played Intellivision for, you know, Las Vegas Blackjack Poker, for the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, and all of that. And so her dad and his friends would come over and play it, and occasionally they would let us play it. In the summer of '82, I saw ColecoVision commercials and the Donkey Kong, you know, footage on the commercial, and I thought at that point, okay, I am no longer content with going to my friends' houses to play video games, going to my cousin's house. I must have a ColecoVision, because I could not believe that you could play what to me looked arcade perfect version of Donkey Kong, which was one of my favorite games at the time, in your house. That was just fascinating. But at this point, Christmases were still just $100. And so I gave Santa Claus $100 plus money for Mousetrap. And then that night, you know, Christmas Day and night, I spent just a ridiculous amount of hours playing Mousetrap and Donkey Kong, sitting on the beanbag chair in the living room. And I stayed up till probably 5 in the morning. And that next day, I had the worst, insanely bad crick in my neck that lasted about a week, but it was well worth it. Loved those games. And then I played Atari 5200 for the first time, sometime in '83 on a church mission trip, of all places. And then in early '83, yeah, this is all around the same time, into 1983, a kid at school brought he was telling me about his Atari, that he was tired of it. And at that point, once the ColecoVision and Atari 5200 came out, people didn't just like say, oh, well, cool, I'm gonna build a retro collection, you know, a video game collection, and I'll have 2 or 3 consoles set up to my TV. Very few people did anyway. And typically it was customary to either give away your Atari, take it to a thrift store, maybe sell it to a pawn shop. A lot of this stuff just got thrown away, like literally just thrown in the trash. And so this kid, once the ColecoVision came out, he considered Atari 2600 uncool. And so he brought his to school to me with 10 games and sold it to me for $10, which was a really good deal then. This would have been around the spring of '83. And so yeah, at that point is when I became a collector. I started amassing different systems, different consoles, going to garage sales and stuff like that. It was very difficult to be a collector then, because video games you didn't have the back catalog like you do now, where you can find, you know, just a million systems and a lot of cheap games. If you thought retro game collecting was expensive now, it was real expensive in the early '80s, until the crash. So I'm going to talk a little bit about living through the crash, what it was like at that point, actually experiencing that. You know, a lot of people hear about the crash and read about the history, but living through it was really, really interesting. So in 1983, again, obviously, I saw an ad for Atari 2600 games in the newspaper. Now, I was one of the, back in the day, a lot of kids read the newspaper. I don't know any kid, do kids even know what a newspaper is now? But a lot of kids read the paper. They read, you know, sports, entertainment, box scores, you know, what movies are coming out, and there would be even like kids sections. And I always looked at the paper on the weekend, looking through the ads for video games at different retailers. And I saw Atari 2600 games for $9.99 to $14.99 each, you know, a big full-page ad. And that was kind of shocking, considering they were typically $30 to $45. And occasionally you might see something marked down, but just to have this big ad with a lot of popular and not so popular games, you know, marked down, you know, half price or less was really striking. And so, because before that, the cheapest video game I'd ever seen was a War Room for ColecoVision for $23 that they had advertised in the paper. That was just sort of a normal sale. But then I saw this and some more ads. And then when I would go out, you know, looking at KB Toys and go to the mall and even Walmart and Kmart and everything, I started seeing these big bins, just these big round or square or whatever, just giant bins kind of in front of the store with games just, you know, full, marked down to $4.99. And that held for a while, and then $2.99, and then 99 cents. And like I said, I'd heard some friends later say they encountered 25-cent games. Well, this was great. I didn't think about this being negative for the marketplace. I didn't think about this having any negatives at all. I just thought it sounded amazing because I could go out and buy cheap video games. Well, this coincided with 2 days after, excuse me, my 16th birthday. I got a job at a barbecue restaurant, making $3.35 an hour because that was the minimum wage back in '83. And suddenly I had money for the very first time in my life, because prior to that, my parents were pretty frugal. And if we wanted money, we had to wait for our allowance or go out and find a way to mow yards or whatever. And that's how I got half of my ColecoVision was for mowing yards. But suddenly I had money, and after about 6 months of working at that restaurant, just busting my ass, I got promoted to a quality supervisor, which is what they called it, and I was making $5.50 an hour, which really seemed great for a 16-year-old kid. And I'm there telling 20 and 30-somethings what to do. You know, I was their sort of mini boss, I guess you could say, and they did not appreciate that. But anyway, that's a pretty big tangent. The point of that is I had money, I had a car, and I was experiencing the crash, and I was a pretty ridiculous video game collector at this point. So I drove around all over Dallas-Fort Worth, checking out all these, you know, amazing, just masses and masses of deeply discounted games. And at that point, it would never have occurred to anyone in a million years that any of this would be worth anything as a collectible, like a coin or a comic book or a baseball card. That was the furthest thing from anybody's minds. It was just, once the new consoles would come out, that was just considered old stuff that goes to the thrift store. And I've talked to a lot of different people, my age and older. Did you ever know anyone who thought video games were going to be valuable and that bought extras and set them aside or kept some sealed copies? Not one single person. Now, I have talked to some people who bought extras just because they thought they were cool, or just set them aside for some whatever, trading or whatever, or just, you know, there's hoarders or whatever. But not a single person I ever talked to bought them for investment purposes. By the way, during this, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. We've got some, plenty of time to cover any of your questions. So yeah, this was pretty awesome. I only bought what I wanted to play, or maybe the box looked neat, or I like the genre. I love maze games, I love climbing games, and I love shooters. I like action games where you can just pick up a game and just immediately start wreaking havoc without thinking about it too much. Love me some action games, so I just buy anything I saw that I wanted to play that was cheap enough. And it was just an amazing time to be a collector. And at first, like I said, I didn't know about the industry crash. That wasn't, I'm 16 years old. I'm not thinking about, the overarching effect of this or anything. And, but, as it wore on, and then the ColecoVision was canceled, and, it was very obvious these second-gen systems were on their way out. That was pretty heartbreaking because I loved the ColecoVision, and to me, it would go on for many more years, and they would keep putting games out for it. And the thing today, with homebrews, that's another thing people never would have envisioned in the 80s. Once a system is out of production, not in a million years would you have ever convinced me that in 2024 that people would be making video games for consoles from the 70s and 80s. It just wasn't even conceptually possible. Like even like Arthur C. Clarke or Isaac Asimov never would have conceived that. Just completely. It's just not a thing. So here's some anecdotes of how you could see in real time the market crashing. So when the ColecoVision came out, it was the hot system at my school. I mean, it was considered so much cooler and so much more advanced than the 2600 and television. And those systems became just kind of nerdy or like you were poor. The 80s were very much, Madonna's Material Girl, very accurate. It was a sort of a materialistic decade. Not that now isn't, but it was very much frowned upon. Like now it's kind of considered hip and chic and cool to go to a thrift store. But man, in the 80s, if you were in junior high school or high school, you did not tell anybody you knew that you went to a thrift store because it was just considered, well, your parents must be poor or you're a loser. And so the ColecoVision was the super cool, super hot console to have. And my friends, we would trade games to play, or if a friend got sick of a game, I'd buy it from a bargain for him. I distinctly remember when Miner 2049er and Zaxxon came out, they were $50 new. A friend of mine sold his copies to me for $30 each because he'd gotten tired of them. And I never got tired of any of my games, so I was very happy to get the discount on those. But one of my best friends that had a ColecoVision, he was not one of the Fairchild Channel F guys, it was another one. He, suddenly, I was at his house one day, and his dad brings home a computer, a Commodore 64, which came out the same month and the same year as ColecoVision, August of '82, and this box of files of games with these floppy disks and Sharpie, just Joust, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and all this stuff. Just rows and rows of games, and he bought all that for, he had this system. I don't know what he paid for the system, but he bought this big box of pirated games for just next to nothing from a guy he worked with. That was just a thing going around. And suddenly, to my friend, the ColecoVision was irrelevant because here you've got 100 or whatever games for next to nothing, and you've got all these great arcade games and everything. And suddenly, he had no interest in his ColecoVision. And that's just sort of an anecdotal example of how computers suddenly became the gaming system of choice over consoles during that time. Also with computers, parents felt more, I guess, they felt like they were being better parents if they bought their kid a computer instead of just a game console because they feel like there's learning applications and you can do all this other stuff on a computer. They can learn how to program in BASIC or what have you. And so computers were a big factor in leading to the console crash. And a lot of my friends, there was also a generational shift. Once I got well into high school, like my senior year in '85, most people I knew, most of the kids I knew at that time, they had outgrown their ColecoVision, outgrown their consoles. I was still playing mine like crazy. And they most of them had no longer had any interest in video games of that type. They still go to the arcades and whatnot and play some pinball, but to them, it just kind of seemed like a kid thing, and they just kind of. So there was definitely, you don't hear about this quite as much, the generational shift. There's that gap where, and then I'll talk about the NES coming along here in a little bit. But, and a lot of the common reasons you hear about is, there was a glut of bad Atari 2600 games, shovelware, that retailers ordered way too many of them. And when parents would go into a store and they would see deeply discounted these third-party games that were terrible, and they were discounted because they were bad or because of the crash for a variety of reasons. Games were discounted. They might buy 4 or 5 discounted games, and then the brand new games that were coming out would get ignored. So it it sort of, it was a catch-22. There were games being discounted because of the market forces, and then those discounted games were selling instead of the new games that were coming out. There were still new games, tons of new games coming out well into 83 and into 84, and even 85 and 86. And that stuff was getting ignored in favor of the cheap stuff in a lot of cases. And people would get these cheap, poorly made third-party games home, realize they were crap, and suddenly kind of lose interest in their consoles. So that played a big role in the crash as well. And computers were seen as sophisticated for older kids and adults. Consoles seemed like kid stuff, like I've said. And then some of the lesser known reasons for the crash, again, some of this is anecdotal, just things I witnessed and my feelings on the subject. The Atari 5200, while I love the system, and I've recently put a couple of YouTube videos up on the 5200 talking about some of my favorite games for the console and showing my collection, it was really a disappointment. It was this massive system with these sort of ridiculous, non-centering, fragile controllers. The biggest problem with the 5200 controllers weren't the fact that the stick was non-centering. It worked okay for most games right out of the box, but they were so fragile and they would wear out way quicker than the 2600 controllers. And a lot of the games were just graphically enhanced versions and with better music and whatever over the 2600. Pac-Man looked great, but the controllers weren't optimal for that system or for that game. And even worse was the ColecoVision canceled the Super Game module. Is there anyone here that is super familiar with the Super Game module and the disappointment of that? So, in, I believe it was 82, Coleco put this big 2-page ad in Electronic Games magazine about the Super Game module. This was like one of their expansion modules that would plug into the ColecoVision, and it would give you, so the ColecoVision games, the arcade ports were fantastic, but a lot of them were missing one of the 4 screens or whatever. There was a lot of, they were missing the intermissions and some of the animations, and, they weren't perfect. But the Super Game module promised to change all that by having intermissions, more screens, and even extras that the arcade didn't have potentially. Well, they made the brilliant decision of canceling the Super Game module, which I was so incredibly excited about, and opting instead for the Atom computer, which, if you know about that, it was the atom bomb, as Electronic Games magazine called it at the time. It was this huge glitch-ridden computer, and my brother-in-law worked at Videoland at this time, which is like sort of a small Best Buy, and he said they got in a grand total of 3 Atom computers, and 2 of them were brought back because they were non-functional, and then they never got any more in. The Atom was great in theory. It was a reasonably priced computer that could do everything, printing and, on and on. It seemed impressive, but what I hear is that they, hastily assembled these warehouses and assembly lines and just didn't have the greatest product management and control. And just so many of them were just failed right out of the box. It never really had a chance, and that pretty much took the ColecoVision down. The Intellivision 2 came out, and cool, a sequel to the Intellivision, but it just played the same games. It wouldn't even play Coleco games. It was kind of a weird white square system. One advantage, it had controllers that could plug in instead of the hardwired ones. And then the Intellivision 3 that came out, and there was supposed to be an Intellivision 3 with advanced graphics and all that, but this particular Intellivision 3 was just, it had a light that you could tell the system was on. Big whoop, it played the same games. So there was a lot of disappointments throughout this time that sort of turned a lot of even hardcore gamers away from gaming. Atari stuck with the 2600 too long. They should have replaced it in 1981. Atari 2600 was everywhere back then, but even then, people made fun of the graphics. Even before the ColecoVision came out, a lot of people that either didn't appreciate the console or that were big arcade rats, they were just like, this is crap. This doesn't look anything like the arcade game. So even then, the 2600 should have been replaced earlier. And this was a big one for me. Until the NES came out, every console before that had sort of a problematic controller. The 2600 joystick was solid, it did the job, but it was kind of stiff and it could, it'd get tiring after a while. The ColecoVision, you know, a short stub and the side buttons could be tiring. The Intellivision disc was odd. A lot of people never really got the hang of that. It wasn't optimal for certain games. And then you've got, you know, the Astrocade, the Fairchild Channel F, the RCA Studio 2, there were a lot of systems there. That was part of the problem. At some point, you know, there's like 8 or 9 systems all concurrently in the marketplace at the same time. That was a big problem. But every pre-NES controller had some issue. And when the NES came out, and the extremely logical up, down, left, right, D-pad and diagonal, and then the 2 buttons, and then the pause on the controller just made such beautiful sense. It was just so perfect. And I remember a lot of my arcade friends didn't like it because they wanted a joystick, and you got the NES Advantage, so that solved that problem. But anyway, I honestly think that was a part of the problem. It's just the systems, the NES really streamlined the controller, and of course that was inspired by the Game & Watch handhelds. Any questions up to this point? I'm going to head into the NES here in a minute. Yes, sir?
Would you also say that the disappointment of the infamous Atari E.T. video game caused
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now it gets a little too much of the blame sometimes, but yeah, they definitely made way too many of them. And my theory on this has always been, if they just would have come out with just a Pac-Man clone with better graphics, and you had E.T. eating Reese's Pieces, and you had some, you know, government agents as ghosts coming after him, and it was super playable, and maybe added some features that you don't have in Pac-Man just to make it different. Maybe that game would have turned out different. Maybe the crash wouldn't have crashed quite as hard, you know. But yeah, that game gets blamed a lot, but it was just kind of almost even a symptom. Yes?
Actually, going off that, because you mentioned Pac-Man, would you also say the Atari 2600 Pac-Man port would contribute?
Yeah, it certainly didn't help. It sort of, the people I mentioned that were sort of already dismissive of the 2600, the Pac-Man port added fuel to that fire, and it was super disappointing. I mean, it's the best-selling 2600 game, and you know what? There's one thing about it. I told the programmer, Todd Fry, one time, I absolutely love the 2600 version of Pac-Man because at that point, I had already played the arcade version to death. There was a little convenience store right by my junior high, and back then they didn't worry about truancy all that much, and or hanging out before and after school, whatever. You just, you know, it was kind of the freewheeling 80s, and they had Pac-Man, Phoenix, and Asteroids, and I played just Pac-Man into oblivion until I was tired of it, and I was really happy when Miss Pac-Man came out because it was so much more dynamic with 4 screens and everything, and better AI. So I really loved the 2600 version of Pac-Man, and a lot of people I knew liked it because it was just a different challenge. And if you dim the lights and put it in black and white mode, the blinking's not so bad. But you know, it presented a new challenge. But yeah, it did play a part. You know, it was a disappointment. So there was a lot of factors. Any more questions about the crash before I lead into the NES? Yes, sir.
Would you also say that maybe some of the Atari quote-unquote computers may have contributed to the crash? For instance, the Atari 400 with that ridiculous flat keyboard, which really was just a 5200 in disguise as a home computer.
Yeah, and I would say what played more of a role was the Atari 800 and the Commodore 64 just being more appealing to a lot of parents than consoles because of all the features. I think that had more to do with it than yeah, that was a big factor for sure. As far as that probably had more to do with it than the fact that the 400 might have been a disappointment with that lame keyboard. Anything else before I get into NES?
But you mentioned that the copying games. I remember when we got the 800, my dad all of a sudden, his friends at work or something, we just had games galore.
Oh, it was
I don't think we were
insane.
buying anything.
Oh, it really killed console sales in a big way, for sure. Yeah, that was, and we never had a computer in my house, so I missed out on all that. But I did, again, friends, go to their house, and I was really impressed with a lot of the Commodore 64 arcade ports because some of those were even better than ColecoVision. I had to admit, because I was Team Coleco, but I had to say these Commodore 64 stuff was pretty impressive. Anything else about the crash? Yes?
I was just going to take off on the Commodore 64 tangent. I used to have a lot of those pirated games myself, and I would sit there on the crack screens because they would oftentimes have amazing music that played right before the game, and so I would just listen to that before playing a game.
Oh, that's cool.
Lost a lot of time doing that.
Right, and I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, Commodore 64s were everywhere. You could get the console, because it's the best-selling single iteration of a computer of all time. Even to this day, it's the best-selling specific model of a computer. And you would just see them in thrift stores all the time for $10 a pop. And I bought one just to use the cartridge port to play cartridge games. And I collected that, the TI-99 and the Atari 800, and I just treated them like consoles. Every time I would get a hard drive for the Commodore 64, it never worked. With those floppy disks and everything, that just never worked for me. Anybody else have a crash question?
I just have one more question. Which, at the time, which console had a bigger market share, the ColecoVision or the Atari 5200?
ColecoVision.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was much more successful, and they were brilliant by packing Donkey Kong in with it. That Donkey Kong pack-in paired with that commercial. You guys remember the commercial where the guy's standing at an arcade and there's 3D ships coming out at him, and then I'm like, okay, that's hyperbole. And then they show him playing Donkey Kong on the screen, and that really did it, having Donkey Kong as a Pac-Man. And then enough console ports that people had heard of, like Turbo and Zaxxon, paired with all these obscure... The one thing... my favorite pre-NES console was ColecoVision, and a big part of it is because it introduced me to games even I had never seen in the arcades. Like before ColecoVision came out, I'd never heard of like looping, and I wasn't really familiar with Cosmic Avenger. And there were some other obscurities like Venture, and we had a mousetrap at the local mall, but there were several arcade ports for the ColecoVision that really made it, with the 5200, a lot of it was just, okay, well, I had those on the 2600, but for ColecoVision, you're getting all these new and interesting games. So yeah, the ColecoVision for sure, it was the console of choice. And anecdotally too, where I was, everybody wanted a ColecoVision. All right, so the NES, as everybody knows, and it's good to clarify that it sort of resurrected the North American home console market, because there were other parts of the world where the console market really wasn't affected that much, but specifically the North American console market. And it did this for several reasons, but there was also some luck involved. When the NES was released, test marketed in '85 and released to wide all over the country in '86, the glut had pretty much been taken care of. All those heavily, deeply discounted games, by '86, stores had pretty much cleared out most of that inventory. And so the way Nintendo marketed it as an entertainment system and not just specifically a game console with the Trojan horse of the robot and the gun and game packs, they had all this terminology that sort of tried to trick you into think you're getting something more than just a video game system. And it really helped sell the console to store buyers, like buyers for Sears and Kmart. And, they were real leery of carrying video games. As strange as that seems to young people today, stores were very skeptical about carrying video games. So Nintendo was very smart marketing it. And at this time, '85, '86, '87, video game magazines were almost extinct, especially in the US. There was a newsletter out of a retail store in California, a Computer Update or something like that, that published the one and only contemporary Super Mario Brothers review. Imagine the number one console. There were no reviews for games at one point, from '85 to '87. You could barely find any reviews for video games. So like when Legend of Zelda and Metroid came out, you could not just go find a review of those unless you just found some obscure little independent publication. And it was just mind-blowing. But with Nintendo Power helping resurrect, you don't hear about this enough. Nintendo Power sort of helped resurrect the video game magazine publishing industry as well, and it gave publishers confidence to come in with a whole nother wave of video game magazines. And like I mentioned before, NES had a universally well-liked controller, plus the NES Advantage for the old school guys that wanted a joystick. And the main thing that really made the NES stick, that made it really stand out, that really made it, it sold like crazy, a culture developed around the NES, even more so than the Atari 2600. Now, the Atari 2600 was a cultural phenomenon, and people started calling everything that was a video game an Atari, and of course, Nintendo supplanted that with the NES, but more so than ever. with the tips and tricks and the passwords, adventure games with secrets and surprises. That was really unfamiliar to most gamers before that. Sure, we had Pitfall and Adventure and some others, some nonlinear stuff, and there was some sense of progression in games. But man, the NES just, and it also sort of transferred gaming to sort of becoming a more solo experience at home. A lot of times, prior to the NES, game consoles were typically in the living room. Well, more and more with the NES, game systems started moving to the kid's bedroom because you had long solo experiences like Metroid and Zelda and Super Mario Brothers. And that was a phenomenon. And also, parents became a little more indulgent in the late 80s and 90s than they were in the 70s and early 80s, when we get them a TV in their room or whatever. But the NES just took over. Nintendo Power was a cultural phenomenon. The NES, the Tips and Tricks hotline. And, at one point, Mario got more popular than Mickey Mouse, which was just, again, something nobody would ever predicted, that a pudgy Italian plumber would become more popular than the most popular fictional character on the planet. Just incredible. And more than any other game, obviously, Super Mario Brothers. It was just so much different. I'll never forget the first time I played Super Mario Brothers. So when the NES came out, and my first access to it would have been '86, because unless I mellowed it, I guess, or whatever. It was test marketed in a few places, like Manhattan in '85, and in '86. I didn't get one right away because I was still playing my ColecoVision, Atari, and Television, Odyssey 2, and I'd amassed quite a collection for those. So I was plenty busy and didn't feel like any rush to go out and get one. But in '87 for Christmas, my brother, who could be mean sometimes and could be cool sometimes, for whatever reason, he bought me an NES for Christmas. It was a total surprise, and my mind was blown. Because, a game console, that's a parent-level gift. That's Santa Claus. That's not a sibling. And it was the $99 set that came with Super Mario Brothers and 2 controllers. And eventually I would get the gun and Duck Hunt, start amassing a NES collection. And but the first time I played Super Mario Brothers, I could not believe just the freedom of movement of Mario, the smooth controls, the multi-directional was so much better than like the ColecoVision where diagonal is kind of tough on some games like Venture. It doesn't work great. But just the smooth controls. The first time I went down a warp pipe, it was a mind-blowing moment. And the closest thing I can equate playing Super Mario Brothers for the first time was the first time I read Alice in Wonderland. You're just transported to this magical world, even with mushrooms, if you've read Alice in Wonderland. It was a game changer, so to speak, and it was just, with the multiple worlds and the warp zones, it just completely, and just word of mouth built with, suddenly at schools, the number one topic at playgrounds was no longer the baseball or the basketball box scores from when I was in junior high. What we talked about in the playground was, the episode of Three's Company the night before when you saw Chrissy's cleavage, or how did Larry Bird and Dr. J do against each other. But when the NES came out, the new playground topic was tips, tricks, how to beat a certain boss, sharing, maps and all this stuff, looking at Nintendo Power at recess. It just became a complete culture and really made video games, it was one of those touchstone moments where, they were basically here to stay, so. Anyway, we got a few minutes left. If you have any questions about the Crash, the NES, my YouTube channel, my books, anything at all, yes?
Yes, all right, but getting back to the NES, I remember, I'm sort of giving away my age here, back in the late 80s, 87, I was debating which system to get, the NES or the Sega Master System. Mm-hmm. My friends were telling me the Sega Master System was the better system. Lo and behold, I bought one and the NES completely dominated the market, and the Master System had a relatively short life.
Right.
Yet the Master System was the better system. Why was it that the NES dominated the market and killed the Master System?
Yeah, the technical specs were certainly better on the Master System, and even had some, like Double Dragon, actually has the 2-player mode. So there are certain aspects of the Master System that are better. but the NES controller is better. But more importantly, the marketing and third-party support for the NES
Yeah.
just devastated the Master System. Those terrible white boxes with the black, you know, the grid, and just horrible marketing, and it just didn't look appealing. When you go to Toys R Us, you look at the Master System, you look at the NES with the painted box art and everything, and even the 8-bit black box art just looks so much cooler and more inviting than the Master System. And yeah, it just became the cool console, and you know, a lot of it's just word of mouth and you know what kids perceive as being cool. And Super Mario Brothers Master System just couldn't compete with it. Yes.
So we know that Nintendo had offered the Famicom to Atari
Right.
to be their next system, and they declined, and so Nintendo released it themselves. Do you think that if they had said yes, that it would have been successful, or had the Atari name been so kind of poisoned at that point?
Yeah, it's probably better that a Japanese company came in with something completely different. Yeah, it probably wouldn't have been as successful. Yeah, that's a good point for sure. It could have fizzled, you know. I think once, but again, if Super Mario Brothers was still Super Mario Brothers, word of mouth might have helped, you know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so speaking about that, did you ever get word about, before the NES was test marketed in New York, about the advanced video system? Was that one that was being showcased back at the...
Back then, we know nothing about it.
Nothing?
You know, not a thing, and you really kind of had to be on the know and stuff like that. There just wasn't a place to look for stuff like that. No clue. And but yeah, it's interesting to research that, and even the cartridges look different, and the console's obviously much different. So yeah, that's a good question. Anybody else? Yes.
Do you know what did in ColecoVision? Because it was like the hot console and then it just disappeared. Like,
It was the Atom computer. I don't know if you were here earlier. I guess they were supposed to do a super game module in '82 that was going to just be adapt like a peripheral for the console that would make games with better graphics, more levels, better music. And they canceled that for the Atom computer, and that was a huge glitch-ridden bomb. Yes, sir. Right here behind the guy in the mask.
Yeah, because with the ColecoVision, wasn't it originally designed to be kind of like modular, so you could...
Yeah, it's got a great port. You've got the driving module and the Atari 2600 port and everything. And yeah, the Super Game module was going to go right in there and just make it a system that was twice as good or whatever. Then right behind you, yes.
Were you very aware of the Vectrex when it had come out?
Yes, I saw stacks and stacks of them at KB Toys during the crash for $10 each, $20 each. And I looked at it and thought, you know, that looks pretty interesting, but, you know, I've got a lot of games already and blah, blah, blah. I've got so many stories of passing up stuff. When the Jaguar was on its way out, they had them for $29.99 at KB Toys. I've got a lot of miserable stories like that. I did get my Dreamcast for $40 at GameStop, and those were on the way out, though. Anybody else? We got a couple of minutes.
Just want to give the 5-minute warning.
Okay, cool. 5-minute warning, everybody. Yes.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Some of the things that you saw back then and now know about the crash today, do you see some of the same things in the modern, like gaming?
Well, it's just so much with digital and everything taking over. I guess there's some parallels. You know, so many people are just playing games for free or for 99 cents or $2.99 or whatever. I'm sure that's got to cut into, you know, $50 and $60 games. So yeah, there's some parallels there. Anybody else? Yes.
So a lot of the people who kind of, you know, gave up on video games or moved on to computers at the time, like when the NES came out, did you see them coming back to it, or were they kind of forever lost?
Anecdotally, my friends that I went to high school with, pretty much almost none of them are gamers today. You know, the ones I've kept up with through like high school reunions and stuff. But now that I've gotten to know just like over the last decade and a half, a lot of gamers at conventions and stuff. Now that crew, yes, they come back. But just your average Joe, it really, you know, they just left it behind like they did their Tonka trucks and stuff, you know. Anybody else? NES crash. So again, on YouTube, I'm Brett Weiss. I talk about gaming in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I open factory sealed games, and which is a ton of fun. It's like a time warp. Now, I don't open anything too expensive. I try to find cheap games at conventions to open up just to see what's inside, catalogs, and just the minty freshness of it. It's a lot of fun. And I tell stories of like these of, you know, just gaming back in the day. And I'm also an author, BrettWeissWords.com. I've got a booth just go out and you turn right just along that row. And if you want to come check out my books, feel free to thumb through them, or just if you have any more questions or just want to talk retro gaming, feel free to stop by. Thank you guys so much for coming out. You could have been playing. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.